July 1st, 1916. Thousands of British troops go over the top and attack German positions that are supposed to be abandoned. Weeks of bombardment, some of the most extreme bombardment from artillery the world has ever seen up to that point, was supposed to have completely cleared the barbed wire and caused the Germans to either be destroyed or evacuate their positions. The British have been planning this offensive for months now, mainly in order to help relieve the French fighting in Verdun. The grand plan is a breakthrough, and that is what the British troops have been told. In fact, it's supposed to be symbolic at the same time. The British line is supposed to meet the French line, and they're supposed to advance against the Germans along the River Somme, shoulder against shoulder. Instead of a massive breakthrough, what the British experience is the bloodiest day in British military history. Thousands die in hours. Regiments are completely wiped out. Regiments recruited from singular towns. Entire streets lose every single son of that generation in a morning. No ground. And yet, right where the British meet the French, a breakthrough. The French advance miles, some of the furthest advancement of the war has seen since the end of the Battle of the Somme in 1914, 2 years previous. Why? Historians have been trying to figure this out for over 100 years. Why were the French so much more successful on the Somme when compared to the British? Was it experience? Was it improper shell usage? Was it soldiers, the men? Could it have been numbers? That's it. The French outnumbered the Germans, right? That's why. Well, so did the British. So why were the French so much more successful on these first few days of the Somme? What were the reasons behind it? And are the typical accepted reasons correct? I do not expect to answer this question in the video. It's very nuanced and something that is extremely hard to do. So if you're expecting a hard line answer, you're not going to get it. I'm sorry. But I can offer new perspectives, something to chew on while you think about what the reasons were, and maybe some new information that can help you better understand the battle yourself. I'm the Wolf of 1918, and in this first video like this, for I don't know how long, we're going to be trying to look at and discover why the French were so much more successful on the British in July 1916. Now, to get a couple things out of the way, I haven't made a video in a while. And if you want to know why, you can go to the end of this video to figure that out. I'll explain it later. It's not important right now. What's important is explaining why the French were so much more successful. Second of all, this is a video that I've wanted to make for a while. There's a bigger, much larger video that I would like to make that has a plan out in the future. So this is merely a jumping off point, something for me to look back on and go, wow, I should have covered that, or I really like the way I covered that, and so on and so forth. More about that later. Let's go ahead and look at the French position compared to the British position during the Somme. See, the French advanced basically all the way up to the river. They pushed the Germans all the way back because the way that the River Somme ran was basically separating the German from the British lines all the way down, or almost to that point. Where the Germans and the French met was sort of across the river. The river took a nice little bit of a half-moon crescent-shaped turn before returning to its normal path. And so the Germans, were holding this almost peninsula that the river ran around. The terrain wasn't as favorable for defenses, and the French were right there. So already you can kind of see how the Germans were already at a disadvantage when facing the French versus the British. However, there were areas like this that the Germans still held the British back on during those first few weeks of the Somme, so we have to take that with a grain of salt. But it does add up when we look at everything else as well. I'm going to go ahead and break this down into a couple things, looking over the points that most people bring up when they talk about why the French were more successful and why the British kind of failed. And we're going to be looking at that through those lenses. So, number one, a lot of people will point to experience. The British just didn't have that much experience with trench warfare, and the French did. The French had been fighting Verdun for about 6 months at that point. It had started in February, and at that point it was July. So the French knew a lot more about artillery usage and a lot more about the practical usage of the theory that they had developed. The British didn't really have this actual practical experience. They had been told by the French what to do, but they didn't have the practical experience that was necessary to fully grasp these concepts. So they used it improperly. And I'm not going to try to make an excuse and try to say that they did. They didn't use them properly. They used shrapnel shells when they should have used high explosive to take out the barbed wire. That's a pretty common piece of knowledge at this point when looking at the Somme, when people are learning about the battle. And so the barbed wire was still there. But even then, shrapnel's really good at taking out personnel. And they were also going after the trenches where people were staying and the machine gun nests and the redoubts. So why didn't they work there? And the point is that while the French had more experience, so did the Germans. The Germans had gained lots of practical experience in trench building since after the first couple months of Verdun, their offensive had stalled out, and they went to plan B of the offensive, which was now go on the defensive. So they had learned a lot about trench building and how to construct proper defensive works. Plus, after the Marne, the Germans had basically been on the defensive the entire rest of the war, excluding couple of offensives that the Germans launched in 1915, and, Verdun, of course. So they were very experienced in building proper trenches to defend against assaults and from artillery. Plus, it was just the German theory in general on the Western Front, which was dig in and stay, whereas the British and the French were just temporary positions and were going to take the German positions. So the Germans were very experienced in all that as well. So it makes sense that the British, who were less experienced in taking out these trenches and didn't really know how to use their artillery properly yet, could not take out the German trenches, which were built to withstand the much more experienced French assaults of their lines in general. So that already kind of shows the disparity between why the French were more successful versus the British. The French and Germans were more experienced and pretty much on the same levels militarily. Up until the Nivelle offensive, the French and German armies were basically on the same level experience and quality-wise. The British took a while to get to that level, and the Somme was sort of that baptismal of fire that they got in order to reach the level of experience necessary in order to properly contend and throw punches with the Germans. Up until then, one-on-one, the Germans would wipe the floor with them. I'm sorry, that's just how it is. So, still, even then, the French should not have had that much success, if that's just what we're looking at raw data-wise. Because the French took forever to take back Verdun, the land taken by the Germans, and they wouldn't actually take all of it back until the 1918 offensives with the American help. So, what gives? Why were the French so much more successful? I'm going to keep saying that like a broken record. The other thing people will look at is supply. The British were well supplied, but they were given the wrong supplies, the wrong types of artillery shells, for example. So when they finally used up all their high explosive, all they had was shrapnel, and that doesn't do very good against redoubts and against entrenched Germans, who are going to stay in their bunkers until the bombardment ends and they can just run out and get to their machine guns. Whereas the French had more high explosives, so they could really hamper the Germans more. On top of that, the French just had more shells in general for the amount of land that they were going after, so they could keep up with the massive barrage longer, which would effectively destroy the German morale and destroy their mental capacity to fight. There's actually a few examples of this in the 17th Reserve Infantry Regiment's memoirs about soldiers being so just desolate from the artillery fire that they didn't put up a fight. And it talks about other regiments and that happening to them and experiences of other regiments. I think that it's a long story, and I'm going to get into that in another video. They didn't really suffer through that. But it's also talked about in Ernst Junger's Storm of Steel as to the effect artillery can have. He faced the British bombardments, so towards the end of the Somme. So they were really bad, and he explains just how bad they got. So there's a lot of things about it that really come into play in terms of how important artillery was to destroy morale and make the advance more successful. When you're using shrapnel, that isn't as devastating on the mental capacity of men when they're hiding in bunkers versus high explosives. A lot of the mental distress from artillery barragements is not the noise, it's not the sound, it's not the shock waves, it's the thought that you are somehow alive, that you could die at any moment and you cannot help yourself. You are completely at the will of fate. That's what kills the mental capacity of men. They don't want to leave their shell hole. They don't want to leave their bunker. They're done. They are destroyed men. They have been mentally taken down by these artillery bombardments. With shrapnel, it doesn't do that effect because it can't destroy the bunkers. So when the British have so much more shrapnel shells, it can't give that mental breakdown of the Germans that they want. So that's basically why the whole supply thing is an important issue for trying to explain why the French were so much more successful on the Somme and why they gained so much more land. Now, there's also the question of the numbers. Obviously, this is also important. How badly the French outnumbered the Germans versus the British. The British outnumbered the Germans. The Germans were outnumbered on the Western Front pretty much the entire time. They had enough men to shift around to where they would effectively outnumber their enemy in certain areas, but at the cost of being more outnumbered in others. And that's what happened with Verdun. They pushed all their men towards Verdun, and they left enough to hold Champagne, Ypres, the Somme, and so on and so forth. So it's no surprise that they were outnumbered at the Somme. But the British didn't really outnumber them that badly, especially when compared to the French. Now, my numbers are going to be a little off. They're not fully accurate. But basically, the way that the British outnumbered the Germans was 5-4. It was outnumbered, but not really bad. You know, they had, at the opening of the Somme, in that area, they outnumbered the Germans, not super bad. They had, that numbers advantage. Now, as the battle went on, they outnumbered the Germans a lot more, and they were able to take more land, and so on and so forth. But at the beginning, they outnumbered them just a little bit. And the French section, according to the official order of battle for the Germans and the French outnumbered them about 3 army corps to 1 army corps. And those army corps on the French side were basically the cream of the French army crop, almost. They were the colonial troops which were known to the Germans as the French elite. The Germans did not like fighting these troops. They were very well-trained troops. On the German side, they had an army corps with a lot of reserve men. The Germans did not expect the French to fight. They didn't expect them to launch a full-on offensive, and they figured that if they did, they could retreat behind the river and all would be good. But those numbers aren't fully accurate and they don't tell the whole story. See, the German official order of battle is not the same as what was actually there. See, the Germans would create ad hoc units. The 17th was one of those. One of their companies was attached, one of their battalions was attached to an ad hoc regiment that was in one part of the line. And then it was detached and added to another one. And these regiments, these tiny divisions, these ad hoc divisions were made up of a bunch of units that were torn apart and brought together at different battles. Sometimes they'd never recombine. The 17th was lucky enough to be recombined and allow me to reenact it and know all this stuff. But sometimes they weren't, and they created a new unit, and that's what stayed. These would not be added to the official German roster, and so it's very difficult to understand what the actual German numbers were. Hence why they're so, debatable. They're so easy to debate. So we can go on the safe side and say the French outnumbered the Germans 2-1. The French outnumbered them 5-4. So even then, that's not a huge disparity. It exists. There's a problem. And you can start to see where the French started to have their advancement successes from. So let's move on to part 2. Why I think the French were more successful. I'll get into more of this later, especially because I have all the memoirs of the 17th, and the Somme was such a big battle for them. They have their own book for it, and I'd love to just really dig into that and use a couple of my books on the Somme to just kind of explain what happened in this one sector between July 1st and July 6th. I also have a few French regimental memoirs from the regiments that fought in this sector, and it's really fascinating to see their perspectives. So let's look into just how successful the French were. How successful were the French? That's an important question. Before we can ask why they were successful, how successful were they to begin with? And can we even say that they were that substantially more successful than the British and that much better fighters when compared to how the British fared and the French conditions and what they faced? Let's look at the terrain. The German line sort of extended across the river into a peninsula, as I said before. The French troops outnumbered them, and the German troops were less experienced. You can kind of already see where it's going. Now, I'm not going to say, the conclusion is not going to be that the French and British were the same fighters, and it was just the perfect storm for success. The French were better fighters, and if you put the British there, I don't think that that army at the time could have had that much success. They would have been too cautious, they would have suffered too many casualties, and they would not have done as much damage to the German army. The French did a lot of damage to the German army, and there was a reason why they retreated. So I want to get that out of the way before I continue. With this peninsula making a crescent moon shape, you can kind of see where a new line could form, and you can kind of see why this area might not be defensible. It's a lot of open fields and not very hilly. There isn't really a height advantage either, so the Germans giving up this land isn't a big deal either for that, and they can retreat onto more defensible positions where they already have prefabricated defensive works already made. So there really is no reason to stay except for just to hold them off. Now the first day of the Somme is famously bad for the British and famously good for the French. They advanced very far for the first day. Counterattacks would happen and the French would get pushed back, but they advanced, and they would continue to advance. The 17th marches in, and I'm only saying this because this is where I get the information from for the German side, the 17th. They've got a lot of information about this one small sector around Aisse Villas. Probably saying that very wrong, and Flaucourt. So the German 17th moves in to protect Flaucourt and Aisse, and the French assault the following day. Again, they attack, they make some gains, and the 17th and all these different regiments push them back. Artillery bombardments start, and one regiment retreats against orders. Now, at this point, it is around the 4th or 5th of July. It's the 3rd to 4th of July, I should say. And the French are basically where they started. They haven't gained much ground, but they keep pushing the Germans back. Much more than the British have done, yes. But they haven't taken any key positions and held them. So what gives? Well, their artillery bombardments have been so successful that the Germans aren't able to hold on. See, if the French had had just as much success as the British, which is not much, if any, the German army would be still pretty complete in this sector, and they'd have very well-rested units ready to take over for the other units that had already left. There was one regiment that actually had to get pulled out since it lost like 50% of its effective strength due to casualties on the first day of the Somme alone. One battalion of the 17th Reserve Infantry Regiment had to take over a position that was held by an entire regiment because the regiment was that shattered, both mentally and strength-wise. So the French are doing a great job at whittling down the German forces. That's what trench warfare is. It's attrition warfare. And the French have become very good at what they're doing. They're not taking a lot of casualties, and they're dishing out a ton of damage to the German army. But then it changes. The second and third day, the French suffer bad casualties. Some of the regiments are even so badly wounded they won't see combat until 1918. So why did they continue pushing forward? How did they break through? Well, a regiment retreats against orders in an artillery bombardment, forcing all the other regiments to pull back from their positions that they had held so bravely the previous couple days. And they pull back further, past Flaucourt. Suddenly, the French are just facing a rearguard unit. See, that's the problem that I have with this whole outlook on the Somme. Pretty much no one talks about it, but the French were facing a rearguard unit after the first 5 days. That doesn't take away what they did and the sacrifices the men made. They were able to whittle down the Germans enough to where they had to give up the positions. Granted, it was worthless land and not a very tenable position for them to begin with, but the French found success. Necessary success to continue the war effort and to boost morale. Although the Germans might have given up positions they saw as worthless in the long run, especially considering the damage their army was in, they gave the French a moral victory. Not really a moral victory, a morale victory, I should say. And that's the big important thing. The British are failing at what they're doing. They cannot successfully break through the German lines, and they won't until September. The French have done it on day 4. Even though it's just a rearguard unit, it's still just as important. But that's effectively why the French were able to find so much success. They go off, they whittle down the German forces, which weren't already put up to full strength anyway because the Germans didn't see the French having much success. And if the French did find success anyway, they can just pull back to other positions and say, whatever, this is worthless land, who cares? They have land to give up. They can give up land for time. It doesn't matter. The problem is that the Germans lose tons of men in the process, experienced men. Units suffer heavy casualties in this sector. And that's why the French success is so successful, and that's where their success is in the casualties they're able to withstand while not withstand, dish out while not sustaining many themselves. The Germans underestimated the French 100% during the Somme. They assumed the French wouldn't launch a very good offensive, so they didn't really build up their defenses against the French very much. They didn't really care about that sector. They moved troops there that were good at defending, but not really a lot of them, because they thought that the French would attack. They knew about the Somme offensive. They knew what the plan was. They just didn't assume the French would do much. But the French hit hard, and they struck true. And the Germans would fall back behind the river, and the lines would stop moving in the French sector for the entirety of the offensive. The French might make small gains here or there, and it's not from lack of effort. The French continued to try to take ground and to help the British, but they stopped, because the Germans reached a point that was their defensive line, and the French weren't able to break through anymore. Meanwhile, the British were. They learned from their lessons, and they continued punching at the Germans at 100% effort. And they broke through. In conclusion, the French success can be attributed to lack of German readiness, French experience, and the fact that we have what we recognize as success as wrong. The French were successful because they dished out more casualties than they sustained, not because they gained several miles of worthless land. The Germans gave that up. Because the French, now it was because the French dished out heavy casualties, they couldn't sustain their position anymore. But they could give it up. In other sectors on the British area, where the same situation happened, the Germans had to fight to the last man, because they couldn't give it up. In this area, they could. And the French were able to take advantage of that and win a morale victory to increase the willingness of the French people to fight on and win the war eventually at some point in 1918. The French saw more success because of a multitude of factors. Not a very exciting answer. There isn't an exciting answer when it comes to World War I. World War I is dirty. World War I is disgusting. It's boring. It's men sitting in lines, huddled in mud, trying to stay warm against all the odds, against the weather, trying to survive the artillery bombardments. Answers to these questions are rarely ever exciting. So I apologize for the lack of an exciting, oh yes, it was definitely because of this type of answer. The French were successful because they were simply better at what they were doing than the British. This would change. The British would become much better at fighting in the trenches and much better at trench warfare than the French once the Nivelle offensive killed off all the experienced French troops and the French army was basically completely destroyed. But the British would eventually become the better army at contending with the Germans and, in my opinion, win the ground war against them in 1918. But here, in 1916, in July, the French were better. The French were better equipped, better planned, better manned, better stocked. They knew what they were doing, and they executed properly. I'll be doing a future video on this at some point to go into more detail on the events here, which will help explain and unlock more reasons as to why the French were so much more successful from a land perspective, and why the French success should actually be attributed to the casualty difference and not the land taken. I think that's such a stupid, I guess, it's probably a rude word to say, but it's such a stupid thing to look at when you look at World War I. If you're not capturing a major city, then the objective is not land, it is 100% the casualty differential. And that's why the French were more successful in the Somme, was merely because of that. If you look at the overall battle, the French were more successful than the British overall because of the casualty differential. So that's where the French were more successful, and I hope I could somewhat answer the question as to why they were so much more successful. It's a little bit hard to give a debrief, too long didn't read ending to this video, and I apologize for that. It's just there's a lot to unpack, and I feel like the Somme deserves its own series for the French sector just alone. and I plan on making that once I finish lighting the powder keg, which I'm still working on. Don't worry, it's still a thing. Figure I'll just might as well do an update here. If you saw in the previous video, I just moved to Tennessee, kind of getting everything back in order, I'm starting a new job next week. So that's going to be taking up a lot of my time. I'm going to be in the process of moving again, getting my own place, and working on getting a new setup. So there's going to be a lot of breaks in videos and a lot of inconsistency. I'm going to be uploading more, hopefully. I'm going to be making more videos. I'm going to be getting a lot more recorded and hopefully have a good backlog to upload while all that's going on, maybe once every 2 weeks. So just want to say thank you guys for the support. The continued support of this channel is much appreciated. If you guys want to, I do have a merch shop, link in the description for all these items. There's a Discord server for staying involved in the community, which is awesome. It's growing. It's a lot of cool guys there. If you really want to, there's a Patreon, which has some benefits, which I haven't really been keeping up on because it's very difficult right now because of the move. So I might just kind of turn it off for a bit, finish up on those benefits, and then turn it back on when I have a better ability to do so. If you want to watch me play games and be in constant pain, I do have a Twitch, which I will be doing some more of at some point with streams. There's just a lot in the description to keep up on if you want to keep up with me anywhere else. There's a lot down there to go check out. If you guys really like this video and you want to support me, feel free to just hit subscribe, like, and comment. It helps the YouTube algorithm. I guess that's what YouTubers are saying now, just to help support the channel and get it out there. I'm trying to make better content, so I hope I'm improving at some level. The background's really bad. I'm sorry about that. I'm really trying to get everything into a better shape, and the lighting's awful too, but that's more because this room has bad lighting, and hopefully that will change too. I appreciate all the support, guys, and I really hope to catch you guys in the next video where I'll talk about something. Leave your feedback in the comments below, and yeah. Auf Wiedersehen und tschüss, meine Kameraden.